Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer, and our episode being filmed here at the studio on St. Patrick's Day is Colonial Painters, an Appreciation. So a little bit of context here. For 30 years, I was part of an American Studies team at Otter Valley Union High School. And one of the joys about this interdisciplinary approach to teaching about our national past is that we were able to incorporate studies of artists. And as we begin our celebration of the 250th anniversary of the beginning of the American Revolution, I'm going to take you on a tour of 6 artists, all of whom were born in the colonies, lived through the American Revolution, which was a defining watershed for all of them. And before we look at our 6 individual artists, just a look at some of the skills or lack thereof of artists who did not have professional training. We have a portrait here, circa 1790, by an artist known as a primitive, because it is recognizable, of course, as a lady, but the artist lacked some skill. This is Mrs. Rufus Hathaway, who is depicted with her pets, and you can see that her facial features are somewhat crude, but it is a charming picture nonetheless. But if we look at the way that her arm is positioned, if her arm were fully extended, it would be almost as long as a lower order primate. And we'll see how our artists under study here improved upon images like this. Another favorite primitive painting of mine, which is at the Cooperstown Museum in Cooperstown, New York, is this very odd painting of a little girl called Emma von Name. And here she is with a huge goblet of berries. She has a little whistle around her neck, and her face for a child looks like a young adult on a child's body. These were 2 examples of portraits. Here is an example of a primitive landscape by the Quaker artist Edward Hicks, and this is called The Peaceable Kingdom. It's a very, very quaint picture, and part of this is the text from Isaiah in the Old Testament of when the lion lies down with the lamb. The first of the artists that we're going to study is Benjamin West. And Benjamin West was born in rural Pennsylvania in 1738. We see here 2 self-portraits of him. He exhibited a great deal of talent when he was a child. And in 1760, when he was just 22 years old, he left his native Pennsylvania and he went to Italy to study. There was no art school per se, but artists who could afford it spent time in museums copying works of the masters. And by 1763, Benjamin West settled in London, where he would live for the rest of his life. One of the things that we need to establish here is what the criteria was for historical landscape painting. Benjamin West did this historical landscape called Agrippina Landing at Brindisi in 1765. And you can see that the various figures here look like they're assembled on a stage. The paradigm for painting historical scenes at this time was to have everyone clad in togas. And even though the event might have been in modern times, the custom of historical landscape painting was to have everything look as if it were Roman. The painting that broke the mold was The Death of General Wolfe, painted in 1770. At the center of the painting, we have the mortally wounded James Wolfe, who died at the Battle of Quebec in 1759. We can see he is in a recumbent position, very much influenced by Michelangelo's Pietà. And here, this general looks like he is a dying martyr. And we can see that the battle being won in the left-hand side of the portrait, and then the darkness of the army that is being defeated. So Wolfe here is made out to be the hero of the Battle of Quebec, which of course changed the fate of French North America. And this was a revolutionary painting that had a great deal of influence on other artists because it was set in modern times. And lest we feel too sympathetic for General James Wolfe, he was a brutal war leader who practiced one of the first instances of known biological warfare when he would give smallpox-infected blankets to the Native Americans so they would die of smallpox. This is another image that Benjamin West painted called Penn's Treaty with the Indians. And here, what is at the center of the painting is the treaty itself. So slightly to the left of center, looking like the man on the Quaker Oats box, we have William Penn. And this, once again, shows that when we are reimagining a historical scene, because this would have been long before Benjamin West was born, it's assembling the characters, the personages, as if they were on a stage. An allegorical painting of Benjamin Franklin, which was done after his death, the apotheosis of Benjamin Franklin, which is very much lionizing his experiments with electricity. And we can tell that this is in the classical image with various heavenly figures, angelic figures being depicted here. So Benjamin West, of course, is considered by many to be a British artist because he spent the majority of his life in England. He became the president of the Royal Academy and a friend of King George III. By contrast, we have another artist born in Massachusetts, born in Boston in 1738, John Singleton Copley. He is at the top of this wonderful self-portrait of him and his family. You can tell that he married into money. The stern-looking man directly under Copley is his father-in-law, and you can see the quality of the clothing, the brocade on the sofa. Copley was trained by his stepfather, Henry Pelham, and very quickly, in the years before the American Revolution, became the most sought-after colonial painter. This is Mrs. John Winthrop, who descended from one of the early Puritan families that founded Boston. It's a wonderful image of the polished mahogany table, the sheen of her silk, and what I think is really wonderful is the rather wry expression that she has as she looks at the viewer. Nicholas Boylston, a Boston merchant who has made his money in the China trade. He has a beautiful silk robe. And in the fashion of some wealthy men at the times, rather than wear an itchy wig, he shaved his head and he's wearing a turban. Paul Revere painted in 1770 before he was known for his remarkable role in the American Revolution. And here, Paul Revere is a sturdy silversmith. This image of the silversmith's bench at the foreground of the painting is very reminiscent of Renaissance paintings in which it creates this illusion of space. So here is Paul Revere, master of his craft. This is a painting at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. John Hancock, again John Hancock, a wealthy Boston merchant painted 10 years before his larger-than-life signature on the Declaration of Independence. And you can see once again Copley's great skill in painting fabric and material, and again with this action shot that we have here of Hancock, who was a merchant, and his ledger that we can see right in front of us. A great picture of another key player in the American Revolution, Sam Adams, who is pointing to the writs of assistance, and a very important player in the American Revolution. He would be a cousin of our second president, John Adams. In 1775, because John Singleton Copley was a loyalist, he fled Boston and he moved to London, where he lived for the rest of his life. And many art historians remark that something was lost in terms of his technique when he moved to London. And I think we can see this in the juxtaposition of these two portraits. At left, we have the boy with a squirrel, who is Henry Pelham, who is John Singleton Copley's half-brother. And again, we have the hard, crisp edges, the sheen of the furniture. We have this funny little squirrel. We have his homemade haircut. And later, we have this portrait of a 14-year-old Augustus Brine, who, because of his nobility, was already given a commission in the British Navy. And again, the brushwork is faster, much more quick and not quite the level of detail that we can see in the earlier images that he painted before he left to move to London. Now, in this next painting, I have a personal history of this. As I was growing up, my parents would have occasional trips to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston on Huntington Avenue. It was about an hour's drive from our home, and back then in the middle 1960s, you could pull up right in front of the place, free admission. And my mother would say to me, "You can go off and you can explore any room you want, just don't touch anything." And I can remember running into a room and seeing this huge painting in front of me and scaring the daylights out of me. This is based on a true incident in Havana Harbor, where a 13-year-old, the man who is flailing in the water doesn't look 13 years old, but John Watson had his leg bitten off by a shark. And years later, he wanted a commemorative scene of this. It's a remarkable painting, and you can see the action of the man who is like a Saint Michael with the dragon about to stab this shark. In the background, Copley, of course, had never been to Havana, Cuba. It's a totally imaginary background as to how he thought Cuba would have looked. In this painting is considered to be proto-romantic because of the great turbulence in the interaction of the characters. This would be in many ways a harbinger of historical romantic paintings, which we will look at in another episode. And even though we don't have later figures of the American Revolution painted by Copley because he was in England, this is a charming portrait of the young John Quincy Adams, painted when he was about 30 years old, when he was the American minister living in London. And a far cry from the images of John Quincy Adams later in life with his bald head, when he was called Old Man Eloquent. Charles Willson Peale, one of the most versatile artists that we are studying. He was a silversmith, a saddle maker, a watchmaker, a naturalist, inventor, and a millwright. He sired 17 children by 2 wives. He fought in the American Revolution, truly was a friend of George Washington. This image of the Peale family, painted in the 1770s, shows him and his brother. So Peale is the one who is looking down. One of his brothers is completing the sketch. we have his wife, his mother, and in the background we have busts of famous artists. We've already seen these two portraits of George Washington, which he painted from life. The one at left is George Washington, the first known image of him, painted in 1772 when he was a colonel in the Virginia militia, and we can see that Peale did a lot to contribute to the iconography, the heroic iconography of George Washington, whom he painted just 4 years later after the Battle of Princeton. Love this image. This is called the staircase group of two of Peale's children, painted in a trompe-l'oeil technique that looks like it would be painted in the artist's stairway. This is Raphael and Titian Peale, and I juxtapose this to the image of the museum that honors the tradition of putting the step in front of the painting to give you that illusion. And the legend, whether it's true or not, it makes for a good story, is that since George Washington stayed in the Peale house, perhaps by the light of candlelight, the story that goes with this painting is that George Washington nodded as he passed it because he thought he was actually seeing the two young men. And lastly, we have this painting of Charles Willson Peale, painted in 1821, and it's called The Artist in His Museum. And Peale's Museum of Curiosities was on the second floor of Philadelphia's Independence Hall. And having outlived two of his wives, when he was 85 years old, he was attempting to court a woman who was 60 years younger than he. John Trumbull, born in Lebanon, Connecticut. His father was the colonial governor of Connecticut. We can see two images of him, first as a young man, and then a painting of him later in life, looking a little bit more skilled. And in the tradition that was established by Benjamin West, we have this painting, this dramatic painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And you can see the wounded soldier who was about to be bayoneted by one of the cruel British. This has many of the elements that Benjamin West established with the painting of the death of General Wolfe. This is the surrender at the Battle of Yorktown, or is this? No. This is the surrender of General Burgoyne. Here is another portrait of George Washington. And then the one that is the best known image that was engraved many times over again is the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Trumbull was not an eyewitness to this, but from written accounts, he assembled the 5 key individuals, and as much as possible, when he undertook this painting in 1787, so 11 years later, he actually went around and tried to find as many images as he could to give a sense of authenticity here. So the tallest man with red hair is, of course, Thomas Jefferson. On his left, our right, is the aging Benjamin Franklin, and the portly man at the left of the 5 is John Adams. Trumbull did a later version of this painting for the rotunda of the United States Capitol. He painted that in 1818, and this version, which is at the Yale University Art Gallery, has a different color scheme to it. When the Capitol was burned during the British invasion of Washington in 1814, we had to re-outfit it totally, and this would include paintings of our national past. Gilbert Stuart, a native of Saunderstown, Rhode Island. I visited his birthplace. He studied with a Scottish artist named Cosmo Alexander. His name in the beginning was spelled the Scottish way of S-T-E-W rather than the S-T-U-A-R-T. Even though he was a patriot, he did not fight in the American Revolution. And the painting that really put him on the map was this painting, a full-length painting of Sir William Grant skating. It was rare at this time to have an action, full-length portrait of a man who was skating. And once this painting really cemented his reputation as an American portrait artist, we have some wonderful images. This is of the Mohawk chief Joseph Brant, and it's unusual to have such a dignified portrait of a Native American at this time. And the ever-present image of George Washington, the Athenaeum portrait, called this because of where it was originally housed in the Boston Athenaeum, unfinished, but copied many times over. And of course, this is the basis for the engraving of George Washington that appears on the dollar bill. And we see here one of a pair of portraits of John Adams and Abigail. And one of the things that makes Gilbert Stuart so recognizable, he was really skilled at painting flesh with an underglow, and he built up this remarkable composition of realistic skin by many layers of paint. And because Stuart lived in the days of the early Republic, he has given us the definitive images of the first 4 American presidents. So we've seen Washington, here is John Adams. This is James Madison and Dolly Madison. And again, you can see the difference in age. There was 17 years between them. And this is a very poignant painting of John Adams that he did late in John Adams' life. John Adams was 88 years old. And I think out of deference to the aging statesman, we have a rather soft focus of this. And Ralph Earl, what a character Ralph Earl was. Ralph Earl was born in Worcester County, Massachusetts. He was very primitive when he first started, so you can see that this self-portrait of him, which was done when he was about 20 years old, is very, very crude looking. He married young, and when the American Revolution broke out, he fled to England, leaving his wife and children behind. In England, he committed bigamy, married someone else, and started another family. And then after the American Revolution, I'm not sure what happened to the first Mrs. Earl, but he came back and he painted members of the Connecticut upper gentry. And I think that the paintings of Earl, even though they may not be of the same sophisticated quality that we've seen of the other artists, they're a real window into the world of prosperous new American merchant class. One of my favorite images is his painting of Elijah Boardman. So here is a man, Massachusetts man, self-made, who is proudly showing that he has made his money not through inheritance, but as a merchant. So he's standing here at his desk. You can see his wares, the fabrics in the background. You can see that he is considered to be fashionably athletic, the sheen of the silk stockings, and looking at us with a great deal of satisfaction. And as one art historian has described this, he personifies the lanky new American. This is Justice Oliver Ellsworth and his wife. He was a justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court. Again, they look very serious, sober people, and they got more bang for their buck because not only did he do the self-portrait of the portrait of Ellsworth and his wife, he also painted their house in the background. So here you have the interior looking out at their house. A key figure in the construction of our national government is Roger Sherman, a very plain-spoken Connecticut man sitting here in a Windsor chair. And it's through Roger Sherman's effort that we have the two-system House, the bicameral legislature, that we have the House of Representatives based on population and the Senate of equal representation of 2 senators from each state. So again, we have a sense here that Ralph Earl has captured the gravity and the seriousness of this plain-spoken man. A view of Bennington, Vermont that Ralph Earl did. And Ralph Earl is actually in the painting. He is the man seated at the lower right-hand corner of the painting. Some years ago, I attended a wonderful exhibition of Ralph Earl's works at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford. But the best collection of Ralph Earl's works in this area is at the Bennington Museum, where they have many large portraits. And we have this image of Mrs. Noah Smith and her family. And this really harkens back to some of the elements of the more primitive American painters, like we saw with Mrs. Rufus Hathaway, because here we have the people depicted with something that represents each of them. So we have Mrs. Smith cradling her youngest child, very lovingly holding her feet. And with some of the children who look a little strange, I think this is probably because Earl never quite mastered children for whatever reason. When I used to send my students to the veritable Dictionary of American Biography for biographical details about a painter, and they were describing the end of Earl's life. He only lived to be 50 years old. He died a victim of his own intemperance. He actually died of acute alcoholism. So as we look from right to left, we have one little girl with flowers. We've got the little boy in red with his big boy hat. We have the next boy who has aspirations of being a scholar, and he's holding a map. And then we have the oldest son, not quite a man, and you can see him with his writing crop. And there we have it. So 6 American painters, all of whom put a unique mark on our culture. And one of the things that I take great pride in being able to tell you about is after 30 trips around the sun with these artists and my students, this is one element that my students truly remember. It was really quite affirming to hear from many of them that they would take their children to museums and point out this. And I think that a very important aspect of understanding our past is to appreciate the wonderful visual images that we have of our past, of prominent people in the development of our nation, and some of the great scenes that were executed in a way to really influence how we viewed them, because there was no one there to take photographic pictures. And this will lead to a part 2 next month, where we will look at images of the new American landscape and artists that really became synonymous with American Romanticism. Thank you.